Hello and welcome to today's Podcast Plus, where we bring you insight for best practice in bite-sized chunks. Today we're talking about home working or remote working arrangements for law firms. As a subtitle we've chosen Where Regulation Meets Reality. My name's Neil Partridge, I'm the Operations Director at PDA Legal, and I'm joined today by Samantha Aldridge, who's a Director at P&P Hub.
Hello, Neil.
Hi, Samantha. Samantha, you saw something, I think in the Law Gazette just recently, that you thought was very interesting. What was that?
Yes, it was an article focusing on remote working, and the big news was that this is a national law firm that has over 2,000 staff, and they've said that working from home will become the norm rather than the exception once the pandemic ends. So I think this is big news. It's happening. People are working from home and it's going to continue. So I think this is quite a big thing because there's lots of regulation in the SRA code. And I suppose in particular, your responsibilities as an employer do not go away because your staff are working from home
Sure.
or remotely. So I think it's quite important to think about what that actually means and what that means for you as an employer, what you need to do and put in place. So, you have to keep up to date with the law and the regulation governing the way you work. That's in the code. There's also that you must have effective governance structures, arrangements and systems in place to ensure that you can comply, but also so that your employees can comply. That's the regulatory background. But what do you think, and I hope this is what we're going to discuss today, what are the problems that could arise from this new working from home norm?
There are lots, aren't there? You're right. I think we're looking. Let's look at some of the issues and perhaps some of the, if you like, we're going to, I think, highlight on a solution or part of a solution, aren't we? Some of it, of course, is going to be based upon setting out what you expect everybody to do. The SRA regulations are very clear on this. You need to be able to evidence your position. What did you try to do? How did you try to avoid the problem? Or if there was a problem, how did you learn from it? Now that's something that the ICO is very keen on. And of course, we know insurers are watching out for this. We're going to see subject access requests increasing from staff who are probably concerned about their employment in some cases, but also subject access requests coming from clients and others through staff who are remote working. Well, there's a control straight away. Perhaps your subject access request arrangements were geared up when everybody was in the office, not necessarily when they were sat, dare I say it, probably at home with a cat on their keyboard or something like that. Also, could you effectively investigate a breach? And I know you've highlighted to me before, Samantha, as well. There's a breach of confidentiality that can carry heavy regulatory consequences under 6.3 of the Code of Conduct.
No, and I think that part of that as well is that there is going to be an increased use of email because everybody's working from home. You can't just turn around to somebody in the office and talk to them. So I just think that it could be a big consideration for employers to perhaps do training on this topic and other, data protection kind of updates, things like that are specifically for remote working environments, just to add an extra level of protection from, security threats and things like that whilst we're all working remotely.
Well, I did see something in that, and I think it was the NCSC, the National Centre for Cyber Security, who have actually reported, and it's incredible, they've had 1 million reports or complaints about spam emails since the lockdown started.
Wow.
I know, it's 1 million. In reality, it's probably been 100 times more than that. It's just phenomenal. But of course, as you and I were discussing earlier as well, besides mistakes and things happening, it's not just about the sort of very overtly regulatory issues either, is it?
No, I think sometimes the overlooked problems, especially at the current climate when people are trying to keep their jobs, is just working too much. I think staff are trying to kind of overcompensate, perhaps working harder to prove that they're working from home. There's obviously the kind of interruptions from working from home, communications being left out of the loop. Working in an open plan office, you kind of get to hear what everybody's talking about. When you're working from home, you're completely kept out of all of that. So, there's a bit of loneliness, I imagine, from employees. So I just think these are other considerations and as well as the regulatory that need to kind of be thought about, these practical things. I think so this is kind of taken from that article that I mentioned at the beginning, but the key, it says, is to use the lessons from the last few months to define how you want to work going forward. And I think that's really important. And so practically, that will be considerations such as how are you going to stay in touch with your colleagues? How are you going to provide a supportive network? How are you going to continue to work as a team? Supervision, not just that person being supervised, but if they supervise others,
Sure.
how is this all going to work in this new remote working environment? But there's obviously kind of other things to consider. So
Talking to firms at the moment, and we've talked about this as well, haven't we, Samantha, that most organisations have got some form of remote, or dare I say it, home working policy. Remote working has been around for a while. Now we are doing more home working, but it amounts to the same thing. And if we were going
yeah,
to talk about, okay, what are the suggestions for best practice? There are several we can dredge out of this to really support firms. And I think starting with the home working policy, a review of the home working policy has got to be a good place. But of
yeah,
course, what should that include? And we all think about things like confidentiality, because generally speaking, usually remote working took place for a couple of hours a week, or maybe one of the partners worked from home one day a week. Most remote working policies were geared around management of work for a short period of time. Very few were geared up for months. Very, very few. And of course, as you say, that's when we start getting the human element to this, the human resources, and things like file review procedures. So I think you'd agree, wouldn't you? It's really, you'd start with maybe reviewing your home working policy and to see what falls out of that and what the connections are.
yeah. And if you didn't have a policy in place, I mean, lots of people were thrust into this remote working
Sure.
environment
Yeah.
and didn't have anything in place but prior to this. So I think perhaps looking at what's happened over the last few months and what you've struggled with, or what now would be a good idea to review. I mean, we're going to come onto this, Neil, but we've got some checklists and things in place that people can use to help them identify what should be reviewed. But I mean, putting in place a remote working policy, if you didn't have one, would be possibly something that would be really good to consider now that you're kind of out of the emergency work from home status.
Well, we are actually looking. We're now looking at the future of working, and I think whilst many people will return to a hard sort of hardcore office environment, we're going to see a lot more remote working or home working. Let's break this down a little bit then. So I think this is the crux of it. And when I think about a remote working policy, there are so many connective points with other aspects of legal practice. So we've touched on things, haven't we, like supervision, and we've touched on things like file reviews. Now, how do you do a file review in paper, if that's how you do them, or face-to-face, for instance, if you have a public funding contract or other arrangement that says it must be done face-to-face? How are you going to do that if you're working remotely? Now, obviously, the remote working policy wouldn't necessarily set that out, because that's just a duplication of your existing file review procedure. But perhaps a good way to structure a remote working policy, and I think we can cover a few of these things now, a little list we've developed, is perhaps you suggest or you set out how you expect things to work, but then use the home working policy as a signpost to refer back to the relevant supervision policy, the relevant file review policy, and make sure that they're up to date. That way you're not doubling up on work, but people know exactly what's expected and how that home working or remote working space works within the legal practice and how you conduct work.
Yeah, it's kind of like a prompt, isn't it, to
Right.
review the full policy. Say somebody has this in an office manual or a handbook of some sort, rather than somebody having to find the information in possibly two places. Having it in the remote working policy draws attention to what's expected, but you could perhaps have the full detail in the policy itself
Uh,
or existing procedures itself.
Very much so. And actually, it's easy to control that way as well, isn't it? And one of the
Yeah,
things that we also, or I certainly recommend, have been recommending to some time to legal practices, is update your home working or remote working policy regularly. And for staff that affects, which may be a lot of your staff at the moment, just once a year, get them to read and sign it and give it back to you to say they've read and understood it. It helps you to
yeah,
identify training needs, but also it means if something did go wrong, you could say, well, we did explain this to people. I think what we're planning to do as well is we're going to, over the next 3 or 4 podcasts, we're actually going to dig into some of these in more detail and the touch points with other policies and procedures in organisations and basically hints and tips. But we've got a small list here, haven't we, of things that actually we wanted just to flag to everyone today, things you could consider as touch points
yeah.
with your remote working policy. I'm going to hammer down through these. And I mean, one of the first one, of course, is what to do with personal data and confidential information. That's kind of the obvious one. We're talking about hard copy as well as electronic and how staff should protect it. And that includes having a post-it note on your kitchen table at home, if that's where you've been working, as well as what you do electronically. Now, I think we are planning to do, in the next few weeks, we're going to do a podcast on that very subject. Now, we did actually do some podcasts, which I'll flag up again at the end, on remote working, video conferencing, 3 months ago, didn't we? But now we've had a chance to look at that, and organisations have reflected on how they're doing it. It's a good time to revisit that. So I think we're going to do another podcast on one of those in relation to structuring data protection with remote working.
Yeah, I just wanted to flag there, Neil, actually, that I think it'd be important for firms to perhaps discuss these, whatever's going to be in the remote working policy, discuss it with other managers and things that might have
Yes.
some kind of responsibility here. Because if you're asking people not to write anything down, or if they do write anything down, to keep it locked away, then somebody's going to have to think about, do they have that kind of capability to lock things away when they're at home, and things like that. So I think there's got to be, it might link in with lots of other considerations.
Yes, I am looking forward to that podcast because it's such a huge subject. But I mean, linked to that as well is also things like your Article 30 record. The GDPR says you've got to know what you're processing, how you're controlling it, which dovetails into what we've just talked about. So if people are remote working, how have you documented the controls you've got in place, physical and soft controls? What applications are people using? Do you know what they're using? Is it under control? Did I see 48% of people recently said they're not using the systems they were told to use, even though 80 or 90% of IT professionals think that their teams probably are using the right stuff?
This is the good thing about the policy. If you have a remote working policy, maybe staff just don't know what's the appropriate ones that can be used, whether they can use something else.
Indeed, because of course this crept up on everybody without us having time to plan it. Exactly. And also staff using personal devices. How should staff be available to colleagues, and information made available to colleagues? How will people be supervised? How will file reviews done? Now, I think we're definitely going to do another podcast on supervision and file reviews very, very soon in the context of remote working, because that's a key regulatory and operational control, and it's going to be quite hard to manage, I think, for some practices. I think we're going to do another session very soon on remote working versus people. So how is that affecting people, as you've alluded to, Samantha? Not just supervision, but motivation, loneliness, overworking, overstretching, and now we're talking about capacity again, and that is a regulatory problem, as well as clients and client care, their people. How are you going to do that? So I think that's another big subject to cover. Also, what can you and can't you do while you're working in terms of personal devices or using firms' devices? Reporting procedures, are they clear? It's amazing the number of people I talk to who say, if I'm working at home, I think I'd call my supervisor if there was a breach. Whereas in actual fact, that the overall policy of the firm says, no, you don't. You call your data protection lead. But again, there's a bit of misalignment there. And of course, there's health and safety requirements as well. So if I was to sort of look back at what needs to be touched on in a home working policy, I would definitely consider all the things we've mentioned there and just go back to the policies and procedures in your manual that cover those and just say, have they changed? Do they need to change? How do we signpost those into and out of the home working policy? So as you said, Samantha, people can use this. You have to update it once, but then people can use that as a working document. But I know you've also seen further guidance on this, haven't you?
Yes, I mean there is further guidance out there, and some particularly helpful stuff is on the ICO website, which provides security checklists for employers. We've obviously produced other podcasts which might be helpful, but there is guidance out there, and I think it's worth kind of double checking what you might already have in place or what you could possibly put in place with other kind of regulatory guidance. Would be really helpful.
That's terrific. Thank you. I'd love to add more. I think you would as well, but it's time to wrap up. Time flies. But as you've alluded to, we do have a number of podcast sessions and now downloadable checklists that we drafted. They're on the PDA Legal website, which is, the link is on there. You're very welcome to go and visit. They're all free, including, as Samantha's mentioned, essentials for home working and essentials for video conferencing, as well as for law firms, if you like, preparing for post-lockdown growth. That was our podcast 2 weeks ago. And on the right-hand side, you can also see a checklist, which we prepared for business systems and for people, where we actually set out, if you think like, the things you might like to consider to support the growth or at least sustaining your legal business through the back end of the COVID lockdown. We've got Samantha's details and my details if you'd like to get in touch with us to discuss anything you've heard today. But Samantha, I think it's just time for me to say thank you very much for joining me again, and we look forward to everyone joining us again soon.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you.